Alright you lots, Wildlife Moto here, out and about on a beautiful Sunday morning today. And just a couple of days ago I got that little brown envelope land on my doorstep letting me know that I have to pay my little governmental bribe to keep my bike on the road for another 12 months, which means that somehow I've already had this bike for a year. So that gives me the perfect opportunity to head out for a little ride with you guys and talk to you about the good, the bad and the ugly in my first 12 months of Interceptor ownership. So let's do it! Now before we get too deep into this, there are a couple of important caveats that are definitely worth mentioning. The first one being that although this is 12 months of ownership, it hasn't exactly been a typical year. So I haven't done all the miles that I would usually do in a typical year's worth of riding. I've done coming up for 1,800 miles, which is probably about a third of what I would usually like to get through on a bike like this. The second caveat that's worth knowing before we get too deep into this video is that I have changed quite a lot on this bike, but I will be taking a bit of a stock view. You know, I won't talk too much about the mods in this video because I know that's a personal thing that's on this bike, but I'll tell you some of my reasons why I've done what I've done. So let's kick this video off and talk about the general fit and finish of this bike after 12 months. Being you call it a budget bike or a bike that's built to certain price points, there is a fair amount of skepticism, I suppose, that comes with these bikes. I think the expectation is that it's going to be a little bit iffy. And I've got to be completely honest, there's been nothing on this bike that has caused me any issues above and beyond what you'd expect on any other bike. Electrics have been fine, engine casing has been fine, paintwork is very good as well. You know, I look after the bike, I keep it waxed and polished and I keep it in a garage so it's stored in the dry. If you give them the respect they deserve, then they will treat you just fine. And I've got to say, there's absolutely no reason to worry if you think about getting into this bike about the quality of the component parts in terms of their durability. I think those days and the kind of mythology of Royal Enfield being a little bit of a rust bucket and not a bike to be trusted in terms of durability, those days are gone. It's a quality machine, look after it, it will look after you. Now in terms of the mechanical side of things, I've had absolutely zero problems, none whatsoever. It's been absolutely flawless and I've ridden this bike in all weather conditions, out in the rain, in the cold, nice days like this. So the mechanical side of the bike, really nothing to worry about. One of the really great things that I've come to realise is just how easy this machine is to work on. Apart from doing its 300-mile kind of mini service, I've never had a professional mechanic look at this bike, and I don't think I will again because I've now changed so much. The bike's kind of fully modified, so my warranty is burnt, but so easy to do the most common tasks. You know, anything from just basic stuff like tightening chains to doing your valve adjustments and things like that. It really is a bike that's built with the principle of those older classic bikes, which means it's very simple, just not very much to go wrong. And I'm very pleased to say in the 12 months I've had the bike, nothing has gone wrong. Now, as I said, this year has been fairly limited in terms of the riding that I've been able to do. But to date, and so far, I haven't really found any journeys that this bike's been particularly bad at. And I've taken it everywhere. I've taken it on kind of longer rides. I did a 100-mile trip up to Birmingham quite recently. That was all the way up the M1. Being a naked bike, yes, it's a little bit windy. But because it's so naked, it's a very clean blast of air that comes at you. It's not turbulent or choppy in any way, which means it's not fatiguing. I've ridden bikes in the past that, you know, have all kinds of weird fairings and things all over them, but if those bikes don't suit you, from a kind of height or shape standpoint, you can end up getting really kind of beaten up on them. You don't get that at all on this bike. And yet you can sit at 70, 80 miles an hour all day long, and it will treat you just fine. The only thing I did is I put on the genuine Royal Enfield touring seats, which has made it significantly more comfortable. And although the bike is extremely capable of those longer trips if you want to, I find, for me, I get my maximum enjoyment, you know, on these kind of weekend rides out and about on these kind of roads like this, you know, nice twisty little lanes out in the countryside. You just flick it up and down through the gearbox all day long, and it's just such an enjoyable bike to ride. It just brings a huge smile to your face. So the other positive that's really worth mentioning is definitely in the UK and in Europe, the range of parts and accessories that are available for this bike is just amazing. Being such a popular bike, being one of the best-selling bikes here in the UK, it has meant that an entire industry has popped up around it. Some of it kind of new, but a lot of it quite well and established. You've got brands like Hitchcocks, brands like Tech. You've got suspension manufacturers like YSS, K-Tech, Öhlins. They've all got parts for it. And there's just a huge amount of reference when it comes to different ways that you can change this bike if you want to. So if you're a bit of a tinkerer, you'd like to have a little bit of a tinker on a Sunday morning, you will have a ton of fun. And as you can probably hear, I've had a little play with the exhaust. I've got Hitchcock's open headers on the bike and Scorpion open mufflers. It just brings a wonderful soundtrack. But if you are running the bike stock, the factory pipes are very quiet, which is actually quite a nice thing on this bike, because there is a whole orchestra of sounds to enjoy, not just the exhaust noise. You can hear the kind of valve rattle, you can hear the intake, you know, it's got a really nice vintage, bit kind of rattly, almost a little bit disconcerting if you don't know what you're listening for, but a very kind of mechanical soundtrack. Now, one of the major mods that I did on this bike fairly early on in my ownership tenure was to change the suspension. Now, I honestly feel if there's one thing that you're going to change on this bike, if you like to push on a little bit, a suspension upgrade may well pay dividends. Now, I found over 3 or 4 months of riding the bike, the suspension went from being quite hard to quite soft to very soft quite quickly. Now, there may have been a few little tweaks I could have done just to help it. I could have mucked about a little bit with the shocks and changed the forecourt and things like that, but I just went full on and just changed it all out for YSS. It made a massive difference. So I'd say the suspension is fine if you don't mind quite kind of soft, spongy suspension, but I do suspect that if I'd kept it on, it may have just kept getting softer to the point where I might have had a bit more of a problem with it. I don't know how soft it would have got, but it was definitely loosening up more than I would have liked. Now, if I was to pick a couple of little niggles on the bike that I've noticed, I would say the clocks are a little bit iffy, in that they just mist up. They seem to let a lot of moisture in there, condensation, whatever it is. You've got to be a little bit careful when you're cleaning the bike. There might be a way to seal them up or something with a bit of silicone or something, I don't know, but they yeah, not great from that standpoint. I also had to replace my clutch cable because that was in not great condition out of the factory. It got a little bit chewed up. So I switched it out for the Venhill control line, which has been much nicer. Lovely, lovely. I felt like the brakes on the bike could be a little bit better, but that was, again, that was resolved with the Brembo sintered pad. Highly recommend that you get the Brembo sintered pads up in these calipers. And talking of the calipers, I suppose the other negative that's worth mentioning, and it may not be an issue if you're buying a new bike, but it's an issue for existing owners, that is that we all have to take them back in to the dealership to get the calipers changed out. There's been a recall on these Vibre anchors, and the reason for that is corrosion. Apparently they've been corroding in extreme circumstances. They've been locking up, and yeah, as you can imagine, that's not acceptable. So I got my little letter through the post the other day. I haven't done it yet, but I need to get that done. I will say there's absolutely no signs of corrosion, at least on the outside of my calipers, so I'm not particularly worried, but I will get it done as a matter of course down the line anyway. And outside of that, I would really struggle to find an awful lot wrong with this bike. It's been absolutely fantastic for me. I've also had the stock Pirelli Phantoms on for a year. Now, I've been promising myself I'll change them out and I'll get rid of them and blah blah blah, but do you know what? Now that they've scrubbed in a little bit, they're not the worst tyres in the world, they're not horrendous. I'm actually kind of okay with them. But at some point, they will get changed out. But I think fundamentally, if there was just one thing that you might wish for on this bike, and maybe not everyone does, but some might, that would just be a little bit more potency. It's a little bit more poke. I think when Hitchcocks dynoed their stock Interceptor, it was hitting about 40 horsepower at the rear wheel. So that's once it's gone through the crank, through the final drive, and where the rubber hits the road. So 40 horsepower, it's, well, it is what it is, isn't it? It's not massive. It's fast enough, but it's not gonna tear your face off. And that's why I've been exploring the idea of something like a big bore kit, which it just changes everything in terms of that low down pull. This is a bike where you do have to work the gears quite a lot to kind of make up for that lack of power. You get through the gearbox very quickly, whereas when you open it up to the 865, for example, you can just chug it through the gears a lot more than the stock setup. But that is a whole different ball game when you start getting into big bores and things like that. It's not going to be something that most people have the faintest bit of interest in doing to their bikes. Mainly from a cost standpoint, it is just a very expensive thing to do. But if you are just a die-hard fan of this bike, if you just love it for that simplicity, that kind of vintage character, then it may be worth that investment for you. For me, this feels like a very unique and special bike. I can only describe it as the kind of machine that if you manage to put it into a time machine and take it back to the 1960s, nobody would really bat an eyelid. Just be like, oh yeah, it's a bike. Whereas if you took something like a new Bonneville back to the 60s or 70s, people would be calling witchcraft. They'd wonder where you'd come from on this machine of the future. You know, they feel like much more modern bikes, and some people like that. Some people like the creature comforts that brings. But if you're looking for something that almost feels like new old stock, as I say, or old new stock, what way round is it? But like one of those barn finds where you find an immaculate old bike from the 60s or 70s that's never been ridden and it's all just beautiful and still in its wrapper and things like that. That's the kind of thing that you get when you pick one of these up. It really does feel like that. Of course, lurking under here we do have a smattering of modern technology, ECUs, fuel injection, ABS, the minimal amounts that you have to have on modern bikes to get them through regulations and things like that. But you get the feeling that it's definitely been steered by regulation rather than this desire to just pack technology into the bike. And as such, this is part of the reason why I can sit here after 12 months of riding it and say nothing's gone wrong, because there isn't much to go wrong. And that's the reality of these bikes. That's why people take them around the world. It's why you can ride them through countries that don't have a dealership on every corner. They're almost proper adventure bikes in that sense. You can stick luggage on here, you can disappear, and you can be fairly certain that your bike's going to be just fine. So as you can hear, I'm not being massively critical about this bike, because there isn't a huge amount to be critical of. It's done everything that I've wanted it to do. It's brought me so much fun and happiness, even in my limited time riding it. What I can say really is, if you're thinking about getting this bike, if you're kind of drawn to that vintage classic style, if you like the idea of kind of carefree, lazy weekend riding, just chilling out on a bike that you don't have to work hard, you don't have to think about too much in terms of handling it and managing it. If you just want something you can sling a leg over and just ride like this, I promise you will not be disappointed. Just know what you're getting into. It's a 40 odd horsepower machine. It's not going to tear your face off, but it will give you a tremendous smile. And if you do get one, don't forget to subscribe to the Wildlife Moto channel for all your Royal Enfield Interceptor needs, especially if you're into modding the bike and changing things. You'll find a whole library of videos up on the channel about that, and there's more to come. So don't forget to hit subscribe for more. And until the next one, ride safe.